Great. Yeah, thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this work today. So this is work that is currently in review at CHI for next year, hopefully to present that at that venue. And this is work done with my co-authors and my advisor, John Chuang, as well as Coy Cheshire and Max Curran. And so to motivate this work, I want to start with a question posed by CLTC's own Nick Merrill, who in his dissertation asks, what do people think a machine or an algorithm can know about the mind, even theoretically? And his dissertation offers a few different answers to this question. But one of them is this one. Consumer sensing devices are already able to grasp at the contents of our minds by sensing our bodies, tools, and built environment. And so this is an argument that originates from embodied and extended cognition. And the kinds of examples that are often offered are things like we count on our fingers, we simulate planned actions with our arms, we actively intervene in our environment in order to understand it. And so the thinking goes that sensing the brain directly is hard and invasive, might sensing the body enable inference of some aspects of internal states of mind. And what Nick argues, and I agree with, is that whether or not these beliefs are true or false, they matter a great deal. And one of the reasons they matter is that they drive the use of predictive surveillance and other technologies that seek to look inside the mind and might help us understand the design of such systems, as well as how individuals might respond to it. So technologies that seek to, or at least claim to look inside the mind are, of course, increasingly ubiquitous, both on and offline. And what Shoshana Zuboff terms big other includes a constellation of tracking infrastructure that use opaque mechanisms to detect and influence behavior, ultimately to produce revenue and market control, she argues. And these systems are especially pernicious because neither its targeting nor effects are evenly distributed in society. And just to add, Sedenberg et al. In 2017 proposed that remote biometric sensing can be seen as a shift or breach of contextual norms. And so that brings us to our work, which is focusing on just a small slice of modern surveillance, that which takes physiological sensing and uses statistical learning methods to produce predictions about the future behaviors of individuals. And we ask, how effective are individuals at evading such systems when these norms are explicitly breached? So just to restate our research questions for clarity, we wanted to understand to what extent do signals like gaze and micromotor outputs predict intention? What strategies are used by participants when they're instructed to make an unpredictable decision? And how well do individuals' intuitions about tracking dynamics align with modern technology? And so in other words, we're interested to find out whether the strategies used are effective. And so we designed a task in which participants play a virtual card matching game that's based on a game called Set. And a virtual adversary is tracking physiology and behavior. So we use an eye tracker in the head-mounted display and a skin conductance monitor, as well as head and controller positions. And the adversary attempts to guess which card the participant will ultimately choose, the left card or the right card. So in each trial, the participant has to decide which card on the table makes a complete set in their hand, that kind of gray box at the front. They have to reach towards the card and select it and move it into their hand during the selection phase. And they have to make their decision without their choice being correctly predicted during the decision phase. And so our protocol had participants go through a tutorial to ensure they understood the matching task and complete some practice in VR to make sure they understood the interaction in VR. And then they then completed 44 trials. And so in the pre-adversary trials, those are indicated by blue boxes there, participants are instructed only to select the matching card for which they get a point. But in the middle of the experiment, the task changes and participants are informed that they must not only choose the right card, but to make their decision without the computer adversary correctly predicting which card they're going to choose. And so a bonus incentive is offered at the end to participants based on their success rate across all the trials. So that was the experimental setup. We ran 55 participants before COVID-19 made it difficult to continue in-person research safely. And I just want to give a sense of the data that we collected. So this is controller trajectories on the left, the final controller position in the middle, and the final controller velocity at the end of the decision phase on the right. Turquoise indicates trials where the rightmost card was selected, and magenta the left. And we can see a clear choice correlation on these top three charts here during the pre-adversary trials, where motion and final position and velocity are highly predictive of choice. Whereas in the post-adversary trials, the waters are a bit muddied, and this indicates changing behavior of participants. But you can still see some choice correlation or segregation of results based on final position and velocity. We can learn a lot more about how participants took on this task by looking at gaze metrics temporally across trials and across time within each trial. So the top row is showing total fixation duration and sequential trials moving from top to bottom for 4 selected participants. So this is trials moving down. And then the bottom plots are showing a time series within each trial of which object in the scene was fixated. So green is the chosen card, blue is the alternative card, and gray is for other objects in the scene. So these charts show a couple of typical patterns that give a sense of the range of strategies employed. So this first participant, for example, shows someone who is consistently fixating for longer on their chosen card prior to the task becoming adversarial, but then appears to reverse that pattern. I'm sorry, I didn't mention, I think that the red dashed line is when the adversarial trials start. So post-adversarial, we see a shift of the pattern where the alternate card is being fixated more frequently, perhaps as an obfuscation technique. The second participant has a similar pattern pre-adversary, but post-adversary reduces overall fixation duration, perhaps is looking less at either of the cards in order to obfuscate again. And this one remains post-adversary highly predictive of choice because there's still longer durations for the chosen card. You can see the green is farther to the right on this chart. And it's even more clear from the time series data that at the end of the trial, this participant is almost always looking at the card that they're going to select, despite some randomization of fixations during the trial. And then finally, I'll just mention this last participant whose pattern of fixation pre-adversary was interestingly looking pretty random, but the behavior of this participant changes to prefer fixations on the non-chosen card post-adversary, which of course becomes a predictable signal once that strategy is detected. So we then wanted to ask how well might a machine learning classifier perform on this prediction problem? So that is, given this set of physiological and behavioral data that we collected during the decision phase, to what extent can a statistical model, in this case we're working with a couple of different types of decision trees, predict whether a subject will ultimately choose the left card or the right card? And so from our 1,200 adversarial trials, we split subjects into training and test groups such that the predictors were evaluated on trials completed by completely novel participants, so no train test leakage. And we experimented with 2 approaches to the prediction problem. So on the left, we show kind of the naive approach, the participant agnostic model, in which we see how well a single classifier fed data from all training participants performs on test trials. And so this model has to essentially find universal correlates of choice with no knowledge of individual participants or their prior behavior. And then in the second approach, we perform a 2-step classification where we allow the model to infer individual strategies from a few trials before making predictions on the rest. And we felt this paradigm was interesting and consistent with many real-world situations where longitudinal data is available. So we can think of online shopping or physical retail as examples. And this is a summary of prediction accuracy results for the simpler participant agnostic predictor. We show forward addition of features and improving accuracy as you add more features. So we start with gaze and then we add fixation features, head motion, and then arm motion features. And the main takeaway from these charts is that even the naive universal predictor performs well on prediction. So unsurprisingly, pre-adversary trials before participants are trying to avoid prediction are highly predictable. So they reach 90% accuracy. And post-adversary, when participants are incentivized to avoid prediction, the model still is able to do pretty well at 73% accuracy. And as expected, the slightly more complex 2-step behavioral typology predictor performs better, and it is able to perform at 80% accuracy post-adversary. And to address one of our main research questions, which is how well participants are able to evade prediction based on their understanding of tracking dynamics, we look at the change in prediction accuracy from pre to post-adversary. So that's what this chart is showing here. Every point is a participant in the test set, and points plotted below the diagonal in green are those whose predictability decreased post-adversary, whereas a minority of participants in red had their predictability increased post-adversary. And then this histogram on the right is showing what percent of trials could be correctly predicted using the approach, and we can see that the largest cluster are on the upper end of this distribution, showing that most participants were correctly predicted in 75 to 95% of trials up here. And though it wasn't the primary focus of our study, we did post-task interviews to support the overall, which did support the overall narrative seen in the quantitative findings. And so what we learned is that thinking about strategies varied quite a bit, and participants struggled to react to the adversary given no explicit information about how it was making predictions. So for example, one participant said, at first I thought, oh, it makes sense to try not to do what you would normally do. Like if you're going to pick this, then look at the other one for longer. And after a while, I was like, oh, that's also predictable, so maybe switch it up. For some participants, the cognitive load imposed by the combination of the card matching task and the time limit were challenging to balance with the needs to evade prediction. So if one participant said, I guess I just didn't really know what it was going to be looking at, so I didn't know what to change. So just to quickly summarize our findings, the data that we collected were highly predictive of choice pre-adversary, but still predictive when the participants were attempting to evade prediction. A significant minority of test subjects became more predictable when aware of the adversary. There were significant differences in strategies that were employed, with prediction accuracy over 70% for the most effective strategy groups and over 90% for the less effective strategy groups. And though it's not necessarily inconsistent with these prediction accuracy findings, we found it interesting that 60% of respondents believed they were able to influence the extent to which their selections were guessable by adjusting their behavior. And so finally, I just want to speculate a bit and try to connect this work to policy. There are many proposals that exist about how to help address the sort of potential threats and real threats of remote sensing in public and private spaces. And our findings here indicate that initiatives like surveillance warning symbols from Alphabet, as an example, and DIY hardware filters may sort of punch the responsibility for privacy to individuals. And I think this work might suggest that these aren't really solutions, as not all individuals have a nuanced understanding about the dynamics and the capabilities of the algorithms operating on their data, nor should they have to. So I'll end with that, and thank you to my co-authors and to CLTC for supporting this work.
Great, thank you so much, Jeremy. And it looks like just in time, we've had a couple of questions come in from the audience, and we have a few minutes left, so we can go ahead and get to some of these.
Great.
So looking at this first question, are you planning to increase the complexity or number of choices to see what happens to prediction results?
We don't have any extensions to this work planned yet. I think that would be very interesting. And of course, the binary decision case is definitely the easiest we could imagine. We wanted the task to be simple, to just kind of prove the principle. And really, we were interested in how people responded and their prior beliefs about this kind of surveillance. But I think that it would be one of the things we would love to do is make the task a little bit more naturalistic, to move it away from a binary choice setting, and also to make the other aspects of the context more naturalistic as well. So to give more of a kind of motivation behind the adversary, I think is one of the other things that keeps some of our results from being easily extrapolated into more naturalistic real world settings.
Great, thank you. And for the second question, thanks for a great presentation, Jeremy. The potential for obfuscation is super interesting here. I'm curious if you think these findings suggest that meaningful user obfuscation isn't possible in these situations, or that users need to learn better obfuscation techniques?
I certainly don't think that it's impossible. I think that what we know from game theory is that in settings like this, perfectly randomizing your behavior is the best way to operate, to remain unpredictable. But in typical game theory setups, what you're randomizing is a couple of dimensions perhaps. And I think what makes physiology tracking of this kind different is that we have a really high dimensional space. And so you essentially have to randomize everything all the time. And I just don't think that's realistic for individuals to take on. I don't think they should have to. And so I think that one of the kind of outcomes of this work, or I guess this is really just my prior belief, perhaps, and not influenced as much by this work, is that this shouldn't be individual responsibility. I think it's really difficult, and this is not the solution. So I think we have to solve this problem a little bit earlier in the process, even though it's difficult, and just reduce the amount and the availability of this data to those who would like to make predictions based off of it.
Excellent. And then finally, we have a great question here from Adrian Baldwin. Are you worried about bias due to subject selection? For example, well-educated students, assuming that is who you used.
It is who we used. It was the typically biased sample of undergraduates and some staff at UC Berkeley. Yeah, bias is a huge problem for sure. I think that this was not a huge sample size, and we didn't make really strong efforts to make this sample generalized to the wider world. I think that future research definitely would need to, or it would be great to look at this with a more diverse sample. Again, I think this was proof of principle. We hadn't tried anything like this before, and so I think that this was just a first step. But I certainly think that this is a limit to how much we can generalize these results because of the lack of diversity in our sample.